of the books and all of the characters in those books that we have for Jonathan, there's really just one character with whom I resonate the most, and that character's name is Dill Prickle, and it is in this book, A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo by Jill Twiss, and it is presented by John Oliver, who is the host of Last Week Tonight on HBO. Highly recommend this book, highly recommend the show. Very funny. And really, Dill Prickle is a very minor character. Dill Prickle has exactly one line in this narrative, and it is this. "I am different too," said Dill Prickle, who is a hedgehog. "I read the ends of books before I read the beginnings, just to make sure they are not too sad for me." Now, anyone who knows me well knows that that line is exactly the reason that I identify with this character. I, too, do not like sad endings to things, especially fiction, which I am going to read for fun. I don't always read the endings of books before I start them, although sometimes I actually do. But I will jump ahead in the narrative if things get a little bit too tense, just to make sure that it's going to wind up okay. And I won't pick up a book or a TV show or a movie unless I know that it has a happy resolution. So while I might not read the last few pages at the very beginning, I certainly know the gist of the outcome before I ever venture into the story. And that's at least a part of the reason why I love Hallmark movies so much, because no matter how much drama they throw into the middle, and there is a lot, I know that the two people, let's be serious, the man and the woman, yes, I know, not great, but like I said, I like happy endings. I know that the man and the woman are going to fall in love at the end of the story. And that's probably why I love fairy tales and Disney movies so much as well. After all, there is almost always a happily ever after, no matter how sad or how tense those middle parts might get. So, knowing that I love happy endings, you might assume that Job is like my favorite book of the Bible, right? Because it is basically the happily ever after of Bible stories in the Hebrew scriptures. God might not apologize, but God does restore Job's fortune and Job's family, as if having 10 additional children could somehow replace those that were lost by significant trauma early on in the text. And God does reprimand Job's friends for being rather uncaring. I mean, everything turns out better than it started, right? That's exactly what the author says. I should love this. Except I don't. In fact, the ending of Job infuriates me. It's partially that God doesn't apologize, which in my mind makes God into a divine jerk. It's partially that the author does somehow seem to think that children are interchangeable, replaceable, and that somehow their deaths are easy to get over if we just have more children afterwards. Okay, that last bit is actually a big part of the reason that this infuriates me. But it's also the fact that the end of the story of Job is somehow almost exactly like the beginning. And especially after the incredible sermon that Martin preached last week about how God invites us, especially those of us with privilege, to imagine and create a world where we are not at the center, I find myself incensed that a story in the Bible that is meant to form and inform us as the people of God ends with a character of wealth and privilege going right back to the life that he had, seemingly unchanged. Are we really meant to believe that a couple of chapters ago, God helped Job to see that he wasn't at the center of the universe or even at the center of the story, yet now, at the very end, God is allowing him to go right back to that central spot in the Eastern world? Really? But wait, you might say, things aren't exactly the same. After all, it doesn't say anything about Job's slaves in this last part. Maybe he doesn't own any anymore. Maybe he actually grew a little bit in that respect and no longer thinks that it is okay to exploit people. And that's not all. I mean, after all, it does say that Job gave his 3 daughters an inheritance, and that was unheard of in those days. So maybe that is growth towards equality for women. To which I say, well, you are not wrong. But even if these little snippets of narrative were evidence somehow of a foundational growth in the way that Job viewed the world, one that moved him to work for equality and justice, then these changes, not owning slaves himself and giving his daughters an inheritance, they're merely surface level gestures. They affect his family, his circle, but they don't actually have an impact on the structure of society. And let's be honest here, Job could have had a significant impact on the structure of society. He could have had a significant impact on the way that his world looked, because remember, he is the greatest man in the East. That is what the story started off by telling us. So what would have happened if the greatest man in the East had said to everyone, hey, maybe we should rethink this entire slavery thing? What would have happened if the greatest man in the East had said, I'm going to give my daughters an inheritance. If you want to do business with me, you will give your daughters an inheritance too? What would have happened if the greatest man in the East had done any of those things? Through his wealth and his status, Job could have led a meaningful change for so many in his world, but he didn't. He enjoys his wealth and he enjoys his happiness and he shares it within his small circle, and that is that. I cannot imagine that the God who came to us in Jesus the Christ, the one who challenged the rich to give up their wealth and to follow him, the one who upended the tables of those who put profit before people, the very one who challenged practices that had more to do with maintaining institutional power than loving God or neighbor, I cannot imagine that God being okay with the way that Job's story ended. It's the kind of happily ever after that is happy for just a handful of carefully selected characters. It's not the one that ends up with the world being better off, which, come to think of it, is not so different from many of the fairy tales that we all hold so dear. Consider Cinderella, for example. The story ends with the prince finding Cinderella and marrying her and taking her off to be a princess. And it ends with all of us saying, and they all lived happily ever after. Except that they all didn't, right? In the original version, the stepdaughters both wound up with irreparable injuries that would have caused them to be disabled for the rest of their lives. Because their mother, Cinderella's stepmother, cuts off the toes of one so that her feet will fit into the glass slipper when the prince comes. And when that doesn't work, she cuts off the heel of the other so that her foot will fit into the glass slipper when the prince comes. The story doesn't end well for either of the two of them. And in many accounts, the step family actually all wind up as poorly treated servants in the castle. Now, you could argue, I suppose, that the stepmother actually deserved it, but what about those stepdaughters? Were they really evildoers, or were they actually just victims of their mother, much like Cinderella was? But then let's take a step back and complicate it even more, and let's ask about the stepmother. She was a widowed woman in a time when being a widowed woman was incredibly difficult. How might that have affected her actions? All of which is to say that happily ever after isn't ever as simple as it seems. And how often do we see the main characters getting what they want and call it a happy ending, forgetting that there are other characters out there too? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For many Americans, this line is a bit like the once upon a time of America. It's the start of the American fairy tale. It's the start of the American myth that we are all created equal, with equal opportunity, with equal privilege, and with equal status. It's a myth that promises a happily ever after to all. After all, everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Everyone can have anything that they desire. Everyone can have that happy ending if they just work hard enough. And if they don't, well, then they're probably just not working hard enough. Of course, we know that a myth, fairy tale, is all that is. If the last 400 years since slaves were first brought to these shores hadn't provided enough evidence in and of themselves, the last 4 months certainly have brought it into stark relief. COVID-19 and the increasing visibility of Black men and women being killed by authorities shines a spotlight on the very fact that in this nation, we are far from equal. Your ability to have a happy ending depends on your race, your class, your ethnicity, your gender, your orientation, your religion, your education, your ability, and let me tell you, that list could go on and on. An ending filled with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is only for a privileged few. It is not a happily ever after for all. So, if we hold these truths to be self-evident is the once upon a time of America, then we have a very long way to go before we get to a happy ending. Yet just as the current crisis illuminates the inequality in our country, it also offers us this incredible opportunity for profound change. Earlier this week on NPR's Marketplace Morning Report, if you're familiar with that, the lead reporter asked this question. He said, instead of going back to normal, what kind of economic system should we be working to build? And he was asking that of a number of different economists over the course of the week. And that, in my mind, is the golden question. Instead of going back to normal, as so many in this country seem to want to do, what kind of societal structure should we be building out of this devastation that we might actually create an America where everyone can live happily ever after? I have thoughts, I have ideas, I have dreams about the answer to that question. But there was also an article in the Harvard Business Review this past week that pointed out that in order to have lasting structural, cultural change in any organization, including a country, the answer to a question like the one I just posed cannot come from a single person, nor even from a group of leaders, even elected officials at the top. It needs to come from stakeholders at every level of the organization, or in this case, stakeholders at every level of our nation. In other words, this next chapter in the American story needs to be written by all of us, not just those whom we might identify as good writers or the author of the American story, whatever that role is, not just our elected leaders or those who are eloquent, not just those who we think are smart enough. This next chapter needs to be written by each and every one of you. Yes, each and every one of you. And you are all more than capable. You are more than smart enough. You are more than talented enough to take part. And I say that because I can already hear some of you saying, oh, I couldn't do that. I don't have the talent for that. Yes, you do. You need to be a part of this. My greatest fear as this Independence Day weekend draws to a close is that our story is going to wind up like Job's. We're going to make it through this crisis, and we're going to have only surface level changes, that structurally America will continue it on in the same unjust way that it has since 1776. And the truth is, that's exactly what will happen if we leave it up to a few folks at the top to write the next chapter in our story. And it doesn't matter who those folks are. It doesn't matter how well-meaning they are. We can't have it be just a few. That is exactly what will happen, those surface level changes. If we don't dream big, if we don't learn more, if we don't engage in conversation and then take our place in the authoring of this story. In the end, isn't that actually our patriotic duty? To dream and to learn and to engage and to join in the creation of a new and just America? In the end, isn't that actually our call as Christians? To dream and to learn and to engage and to join with the Spirit in the creation of a new and just world of abundant life for all people. Yes, friends, this is our duty and this is our call. So on this day, let us declare to God and to one another that we will work together to create a system where all humans are truly equal, and to write a story where there is a true happily ever after, not just for a few, not just for some, not just for one class, but for all people. Friends, this is our duty and this is our call. So let us declare to God and one another that this is work that we will do. This is work that we are grateful to take part in. Let us declare to God and one another that on this day, we answer God's call and we take up our work with joy. So may it be with us.